My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 4. Benner had got his name when he was a 2-month-old colt, on the day that Nell first saw him. She was riding alone on the saddleback one August afternoon, cantering easily, twirling a short strip of soft leather in her right hand. The prevailing southwesterly wind of the Rocky Mountains sang in her ears and moved like a veil between earth and sky. Her white silk shirt filled and ballooned, her hair was loose and blowing, and the grass on the hillsides leaned and rippled and sprang erect again with an incessant murmuring sound. Hay was being cut somewhere, and the strong aromatic scent of it, the late summer scent of hay and mint and pine and snow, had a keen edge of sweetness to it that hurt her lungs. Miles away, a rancher was shouting at his horses, and the sound drifted to her like an echo, made musical and poignant by the distance. Lost in delight, she twirled her quirt, swaying a little to the rhythmic thud of her pony's hoofs. And she had such a sensation of lightness, it seemed to her that on this high peak of the divide, the world was curled in a wave, herself carried on the rolling crest of it like foam. Suddenly, the great gelding she rode pricked his ears. She was approaching the brood mares. Around the shoulder of a hill she came upon them, already on the alert, facing toward her, heads up nervously. Nell stopped her horse and sat watching. Some of them galloped away, the colts clinging to their mother's sides, then stopped at a distance and turned to stare again. A rich dark chestnut colt, fearless and adventuresome, broke out of the bunch and came towards her with a long springing trot. There was a very fury of curiosity and expectation in his lifted head and flaring nostrils. His cream-coloured tail was lifted high, pluming out on both sides of him, and with the full tossing light mane he seemed to float on the wind, hung with banners. And so he got his name, and was duly registered and raised to be the stud of Goose Bar Ranch. Benner, out of the Arab mare El Kantara by Hamilcar. With the passing years, his dark chestnut coat had grown lighter, and the blonde tail and mane darker, so that now in full maturity, the stallion was a bright red gold all over. The name still suited him. He had lost nothing of his wild grace and ardor, and, trotting, still came on the wind, full sail set, head up, and the high, free, springing step. When the moon rose that night, after the long journey with the mares up to the summer range, the stallion was standing, as he often did, on the sharp rocky peak of one of the hills of the saddleback, slanted as if on a stair, with 4 feet solid and close together on the summit, his long gleaming body sloping down, his lofty head and reaching ears the very picture of kingly power. Round about him and beneath him on all sides was a wider world than even his swiftness could ever need or use. The same world of hills and plains, plateaus and headlands, mesas and mountains that Ken had filled his eyes with that morning. Within a radius of a few hundred yards below him were his 20-odd mares and their foals, now weary from the day's long trek up from the meadows. Some of them were grazing, some lying flat on their sides in an ungainliness of abandon which was grotesque in the mares, but in the foals had a charming helplessness. Cushioned on the springing green grass, earth and horse as close as 2 hands with palms pressed together, they lay sleeping under the eye of the watchful stallion. A sudden thunder of hoofs pulsed on the air and drifted away again. Instantly Benner's head turned and his ears pointed. A mile or more away, the band of yearlings was on the run. Something had startled them, or with their crazy high spirits they were just tearing around, turning night into day. Closer by, a frightened little whinny shrilled out. Not much more than a squeal of alarm. A foal, grazing too far from his mother, had come to with a start, alone and terrified, his world shattered. Benner calmly watched the long-legged youngster while he galloped to one mare after the other, sniffed them, and squealed his disappointment. At last the placid mother lifted her head from her grazing and called him. The little one halted in mid-gallop, wheeled, nickered, and ran to her side, thrusting his head immediately beneath her. And at last Banner twisted his massive neck and looked in another direction, down at the ranch where lived his god, Oates. The smell of the big, hard, muscular hand that held the bucket. The harsh voice that pierced his vitals. All this went with the greatest goodness that he had ever known. His world went no further. Together, he and Rob McLaughlin ran the ranch. In the fall, the two would separate the spring colts from their dams, and Banner would bite and kick and drive the mares away, while McLaughlin penned the colts. In the worst of the winter blizzards, Banner would bring the mares home from 5 or 10 miles away, knowing that McLaughlin would have been before him to open gates and doors and fill the manger of the feed shed with hay. Now and then, Banner had to do or endure something he could not understand. This too he accepted. When Rob McLaughlin's blazing blue eyes commanded, Banner looked no farther. Now smoke was coming from the chimney of the ranch house. Banner saw it and smelled it. It was a familiar, good smell. His ears quivered, taut and listening. Often voices, shouts, barking of dogs, the piano, the radio reached him in a medley of sounds, all good. All rob and shelter and food and companionship. But tonight, no sound but the chug of the windmill pump. Banner swung his head back again and stood straight, facing the moon. The golden fire that was in his eye when he was alert died down, and his lids half closed. Nell too was watching the moon rise. She was standing at the living room door, looking out across the terrace and the green. It was a Dutch door, cut horizontally in half, like a stable door, and Nell's elbows were propped on the top of the lower part. Leaning over a little, she rested her smooth, sunburned cheeks in her hands. She had been riding that afternoon, and was still in her black jumpers and white silk shirt. Dead tired, as she often was at night, she told herself that she had letters to write, and she must set the sponge for tomorrow's baking. But she just stood there, leaning and looking across the green. She was thinking about Ken and what he had done that day, and how furious Rob had been. Nothing had been said about it to Ken. Howard always took his cue from his father, so he too ignored Ken. They talked about the mares, the colts, and how long the grass was, and which mares had not yet foaled, and the old piece of lariat that was still tied around Rocket's neck, from the time, more than a year before, when Rob had tried to get Rocket in the chute, and Rocket had broken 3 lariats in succession. Nell had had to drive into town to buy new ropes, until, in Cheyenne, they were asking, what kind of an outlaw is the captain trying to break? The reason McLaughlin had given up trying and had let her go was because she had kicked to pieces the little wooden coop which led into the chute, and had so injured her hocks and legs that he was afraid she would be ruined. "I've always worried about that noose around her neck," Rob said at supper. "It might choke her some day, get caught in a branch or wire. Never turn an animal out with a rope or even a halter on, not if it's to run wild for a long time." "What if it did choke her?" asked Howard. "You always say she's no use to you." "There's a responsibility we have towards animals," said his father. "We use them. We shut them up, keep their natural food and water away from them. That means we have to feed and water them. Take their freedom away, rope them, harness them. That means we have to supply a different sort of safety for them. Once I've put a rope on a horse, or taken away its ability to care for itself, then I've got to take care of it. Do you see that? That noose around her neck is a danger to her, and I put it there, so I have to get it off." Ken had not talked at all, but ate his supper in silence. At bedtime, when he came to kiss his mother good night, she put her hand on his head, and he pressed his forehead against her for a moment, then kissed her quickly and went to kiss his father, then up to bed. Something simply got to be done, thought Nell. I wish Rob would give him a colt. Across the green, the hill was a black silhouette against luminous fan of moonlight that was spreading beyond it. The pines were motionless. It was a calm, brooding night. The line of the hill climbed to the right and became the cliff overhanging the gorge. To the left it ran down to nothing and joined the calf pasture. The young cottonwoods on the green, about a dozen of them that Rob had planted, were swaying. They were never quite still. The round sphere that the mass of their leaves made floated on the air with a faint whispering sound. They were a little lighter green than anything else, like a girl's fairness against the black bearded hill. What tons of water it had taken to make them grow. They had carried water in buckets, dozens, hundreds of buckets of water from the spring, and poured on their roots. And even so, many of them had died and new ones had to be put in. Rob was always having to put in new little cottonwoods. They would never have been there if it hadn't been for his determination. In the fall, their leaves turned pale gold and drifted off the trees and whirled about on the green in little cyclones and curling eddies. I'm glad I've got the green, she thought, like the village greens home in New England. This is really like the East. No, not the East. The East is cozy. There is never the distance, the fat, empty distances, the wide loneliness. Miles and miles before you come to another house. Just animals, grass and animals and sky. You can smell the loneliness. No, it's the emptiness you can smell. Of course, you can smell that. It is empty. Other places, the land is full of houses and factories and towns and people's doings. But this is almost a desert, and it has this sweet, fresh, singing wilderness. You can breathe it in. The very moment you wake in the morning, and it lifts you. You could just float out of the window into the blue of the sky, young and new like the country. It's just the house that's like the East. A New England country house made of pink stone. Not like the Western ranch houses. They're like ugly workshops, untidy, old wrecks of machines dumped anywhere, tumble-down buildings leaning together. No time, I suppose, not an ounce of energy or a minute of time left over from the awful, hopeless struggle to make a living. Sun in the wrong place where it scorches and burns and exhausts you. Black shade where you want sun and warmth. No comfort. The buildings lie in a heap, as if they'd been thrown there, and there they stay. She raised her head and sniffed. The flower border below the terrace wall was crammed with iris and forget-me-nots and larkspur and lilac and petunias. It was the lilac scent that drenched the evening air. Fancy lilac as late as this. In New England, it would have been over long ago. She felt two tiny paws against the leg of her jodhpurs. Paulie gave a little pleading meow. When Nell paid no attention, she proceeded to climb up her leg, hooking her claws into the cloth. At about the belt line, Nell, in self-defense, caught hold of her and lifted her to sit on her left arm. This was the cat's favorite seat. She looped her right arm around Nell's neck, holding on with a velvet paw which never permitted the tip of a claw to emerge. Nell straightened up with a sigh, leaned her cheek against Paulie and smoothed the soft fur. Then she got her sewing basket and Ken's torn saddle blanket, and went to sit close beside Rob's desk in his study, where he was working at his accounts. It's the end of chapter 4.